Declaro abierta la sesión.
The 9,517th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted.
De conformidad con el artículo.
In accordance with Rules 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting: Mr. Geir Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Madam Lisa Doughton, Director of the Humanitarian Financing and Resource Mobilization Division of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pedersen.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2023 has been another very difficult year for Syria. A year that saw devastating earthquakes, humanitarian needs reaching new highs, the economy plummeting to new lows, and the worst violence in 3 years. The year also saw new diplomatic openings, but did not lead to tangible changes on the ground for the lives of Syrians. In short, this has been another tragic year for Syrian civilians who were killed, injured, displaced, detained, and abducted in alarming numbers, and who saw no tangible moves towards a better future. Instead, on top of everything else, Syrians now face the danger of regional spillover, adding further fuel to the fire. Mr. President, these last weeks have seen a re-intensification of spillover effects from the developments in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. We have seen the following: multiple airstrikes attributed to Israel across Syria. The Syrian government reported that Israeli airstrikes rendered Damascus and Aleppo airports non-operational. Currently, only Latakia airport is functional, affecting both civilian air traffic and the UN humanitarian operations. We have seen multiple reports of missiles launched from southern Syria over the occupied Syrian Golan towards Israel and of IDF fire, and near daily attacks on US positions in northeast Syria. And in parallel, Mr. President, violence in all theaters of Syria continues and is even escalating once again in some respects, with alarming reports of civilian casualties. Just these last few weeks, we have seen escalating violence in northwest Syria, pro-government airstrikes intensified, as did frontline clashes, with very serious incidents of shelling by government forces on Idlib. Intensified shelling was also carried out by listed terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and armed opposition forces, including on Nubel and Sara in Aleppo. Further drone attacks on government areas attributed to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other actors based in Idlib, which the government says it intercepted. Turkish drone strikes amid intense artillery exchanges between Turkish and armed opposition forces on one side and SDF on the other. A continued trend of attacks by some Arab tribes on SDF positions in Deir ez-Zor, and no reports of government shelling on SDF positions too. Continuing ISIL attacks in the northeast and central desert region, intensification of clashes between the Jordanian army and smugglers on the Syrian-Jordanian border, with several Jordanian official announcements about incidents on the border leading to several casualties among members of the Jordanian border guard forces, and ongoing assassinations and other security incidents as part of continued instability in the southwest. Mr. President, there is an urgent need for maximum restraint by all actors, Syrians and non-Syrians. No one should delude themselves that this worrying new normal of ongoing escalation is in any way sustainable. Any major escalation would have devastating consequences in a deeply fragile situation where de facto authorities and the presence and actions of foreign armies are key features of the landscape. We need to see sustained de-escalation in and on Syria towards a nationwide ceasefire and a cooperative approach to countering Security Council-listed terrorist groups. And we need all actors to operate in full compliance with international humanitarian law to ensure protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, the socio-economic conditions in Syria are also unsustainable and on the brink. Funding is dwindling while humanitarian needs are higher than ever, even threatening food security. We will hear more from OCHA on this. Let me issue here a strong appeal to donors to fund all pillars of the UN response. Following the expiry of this Council's cross-border resolution, we must continue also to seek solutions to ensure the continued delivery of cross-border and cross-line humanitarian assistance. Meanwhile, the economy is in increasingly dire straits due to a wide range of factors that I have outlined many times to this Council. And we now see critical infrastructure, including the electricity, is under major strain. It is vital to ensure that any adverse effects of sanctions on ordinary Syrians be avoided and mitigated, including continuous and active efforts by sanctioning states to counter over-compliance. Likewise, the core concerns that displaced persons continue to cite, namely livelihoods on one hand and protection issues on the other, mean that refugees and IDPs have not yet seen forthcoming conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns. Nevertheless, channels of dialogue continue as we and our humanitarian colleagues continue to assess Syrian government announcements. Mr. President, the challenges on the ground are symptoms of a conflict that no one actor or existing group of actors can solve alone. These challenges cannot be sustainably addressed without a political process that makes genuine progress towards a political solution addressing the issues contained in Security Council Resolution 2254. I had occasion to review the state of the political process and to stress the importance of moving the process forward when I met with the Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister in Geneva and with the President of the Syrian Negotiations Commission in Doha. And I carried similar messages to key stakeholders this month, meeting senior Russians, American, Iranians, Arab, European, and Japanese officials. I reminded all that international cooperation is essential to get the Syrian political process back on track. Mr. President, the blockage of the Constitutional Committee for a year and a half, largely over what should be a secondary issue, the venue, has sent the wrong signal and been a setback. Despite the non-Syrian nature of this issue, I have exerted every effort to facilitate a solution and I have appreciated the efforts of others too. However, I can confirm from my wide consultations that there is no venue in the region that is both on offer and attracts consensus. And indeed, there is no signs this will change anytime soon. In these circumstances, I have been appealing to all that we should find a pragmatic way forward. Let us all respect the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated nature of the Constitutional Committee. The commitments made by the Syrian parties when they agreed to launch the committee, namely to a continuous process in Geneva, should guide the way forward. Yes, we can continue to explore alternative consensus locations, but in the meantime, we should come together to enable the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva. Let me also remind the Council that proposals for step-for-step confidence-building measures are on the table, which would benefit all Syrians and give an important political impetus into the political process. Engagement, coordination, and information sharing is needed to move from ambiguous signaling to real confidence building via coordinated, reciprocal, verifiable actions. There are concrete moves that could be made if we work in this way. My good offices are ongoing with the Syrian parties, the regional players, and the international stakeholders in this regard. Mr. President, a credible political process equally depends on the participation of the widest spectrum of Syrians. In the 8 years since the establishment of the Civil Society Support Room, significant progress has been made in Syrian civil society of many kinds and perspectives increasingly working together. They are acting as a source of advice and inspiration and supporting grassroots peace building and humanitarian relief and advocacy. I was extremely pleased to have an extensive exchange in a virtual town hall format with over 130 civil society support room participants from all parts of Syria, whether currently based inside Syria, in neighboring countries, or in the wider diaspora. I was equally pleased to engage with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board this month. They remain very concerned at the potential for violence spiraling in the region and the relative lack of focus on Syria. WAM members also engaged with members of the Mediterranean Women's Mediators Network and examined ways to reinforce women's political role across various contexts in Syria and the region. Mr. President, as 2023 draws to a close, it seems no coincidence that renewed violence and popular frustrations, including protests, peaked later in the year. This took place at the same time as raised political hopes on different sides were unmet following various diplomatic moves and momentum began to fade. This should remind us that the status quo is unsustainable and it is unacceptable, and that this conflict cannot be left unattended. It also shows that partial approaches are unlikely to address the depths of Syrians' despair and contain the conflict sustainably. In 2024, there is therefore a clear need to refocus on the political process called for 8 years ago in Resolution 2254. The year ahead needs to see a new momentum injected into the search for compromise for a political path forward. I appeal for all to act in a manner that enables the Constitutional Committee to resume, at least initially in Geneva, and for reciprocal, verifiable, parallel CBMs to be agreed and implemented. Equally, I remind you all that these entry points cannot in themselves resolve the conflict. We must look to engage across a comprehensive set of issues of concern to relevant parties with new energy and new thinking, and lay the ground for a realistic and comprehensive multilateral approach, inclusive of all actors and all the issues at the heart of the conflict. This is the way to stem the tide of violence and fast deteriorating socioeconomic humanitarian situation, and move towards a negotiated political settlement that could enable the Syrians to realize their legitimate aspirations and indeed restore Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Peterson for his briefing. I now give the floor to Madam Lisa Doughton.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2023 has proven to be yet another challenging year for the people of Syria. It started with devastating earthquakes that struck Turkey and northern and western Syria, killing tens of thousands of people, causing widespread damage in both countries. In Syria, the earthquakes hit when needs were already at the highest level since the start of the conflict. They affected close to 9 million people across the country and killed at least 5,900. Millions were displaced, and countless essential service facilities were damaged or destroyed. The United Nations and our humanitarian partners responded immediately following the earthquakes. We provided first aid and trauma care, food assistance, and shelter support. We provided psychosocial support and protection programming. We supported the removal of rubble and worked to urgently restore basic services. However, devastating and widespread damage to infrastructure caused by the earthquakes is still being acutely felt 10 months later, even more so amid the current economic crisis. Some 60,000 families lost their homes, while hundreds of thousands of homes, thousands of schools, and hundreds of health facilities were damaged. Mr. President, working with our partners, we've supported the rehabilitation of hospitals, schools, markets, roads, water lines, and other civilian infrastructure, including through projects financed by OCHA's managed pooled funds. Here, I must acknowledge the generosity of our donors who mobilized swiftly and completely funded the Syria earthquake appeal. However, there's much more work to be done. Survivors are enduring terrible trauma while grappling with the material aftermath of the destruction. And our ability to address the lasting and increasing needs across the country is now being severely constrained by a lack of resources. This includes funding for early recovery initiatives, which could address the suffering caused by earthquakes while reducing dependence on external aid. Mr. President, 2023 sadly saw hostilities in northern Syria return to levels not seen since 2019. Since August, the fighting in northwest and northeast Syria has killed or injured hundreds of civilians. It has forced tens of thousands of people to endure, and many of them, in fact, to relive the trauma of displacement. The hostilities have caused yet further damage to civilian facilities, including critical infrastructure, depriving millions of people of access to electricity, safe water, education, and essential health services. I remind all parties to the conflict that all feasible precautions must be taken to avoid and minimize civilian harm. This uptick in fighting reminds us that the conflict in Syria is far from over. For humanitarians, it demonstrates once again that without progress towards an end to the conflict, it will be impossible to effectively address the extensive humanitarian needs in the country on any sustainable basis. Mr. President, against this backdrop, cross-border relief operations remain an indispensable lifeline for more than 4 million people in need in northwest Syria. Agreement by the government of Syria for the United Nations to use the Bab al-Hawa crossing for the delivery of humanitarian assistance currently runs until 13 January 2024. Consent to use Bab al-Salam and al-Ray crossings, initially granted following the earthquakes in February, was further extended in November for an additional 3 months until 13 February 2024. Mr. President, as we've repeatedly said, the sheer scale of needs across the country underscores the urgency of scaling up the delivery of aid via all modalities. The United Nations is committed to continued engagement to ensure all 3 border crossings remain open. In the coming days, we will formally request that the government of Syria extend its consent for the use of Bab al-Hawa border crossing for as long as humanitarian needs persist. The United Nations will also continue to advocate for sustained and predictable humanitarian access across Syria through all possible means, whether cross-border or cross-line. The huge benefits of increased access were amply demonstrated following the emergency measures introduced by the government of Syria after the earthquakes. These measures allowed the United Nations agencies to conduct over 300 missions into northwest Syria. Our colleagues were able to directly engage with affected populations there, conduct needs assessments, and improve the monitoring of projects and programs. Through these missions, we're also able to work closely with women and girls and their community advocates to strengthen our interventions in response to existing gender barriers that impede women and girls' access to vital life-saving services. These missions have been a net gain, resulting in the enhanced overall efficiency of the humanitarian response in northwest Syria, and we look forward to seeing them continue. Unfortunately, while access reaps benefits in one place, setbacks challenge us elsewhere. United Nations humanitarian air service flights, essential for the transportation of UN personnel and vital temperature-controlled medical cargo, have been suspended since 12 October due to repeated attacks on Damascus and Aleppo airports. Mr. President, as I've already mentioned in relation to the ongoing earthquake response, a lack of funding is severely constraining our ability to respond to increasing needs across Syria. 2 weeks from the end of the year, the 2023 Humanitarian Response Plan for Syria is only 33% funded. Just $1.8 billion has been received out of the required $5.4 billion. By comparison, last year's response plan was 52% funded. Mr. President, as we have repeatedly warned, this lack of resources is severely constraining our ability to provide critical life-saving assistance to millions of people in need. Following the reductions announced by the World Food Program in July, which cut food assistance to some 40% of those receiving it, we saw families increasingly resort to negative coping mechanisms, such as drastic reductions in daily food intake, increased child labor, and growing malnutrition among children. Since we last briefed this Council, the World Food Program has been forced to announce additional reductions, completely cutting its main food assistance program, which has sustained millions of families in Syria for over a decade. Mr. President, starting in January, 5.5 million people who benefited from general food distributions at the beginning of 2023 will no longer receive it. These new cuts, coming as they do amid a deepening economic crisis, will have an even more devastating impact. With deep sadness, our preliminary assessments forecast further declines in food security in 2024, including a 29% increase in severe food insecurity rates among displaced people living in camps and informal sites. In this context, the consequences of funding shortfalls for food assistance will be devastating. Mr. President, the situation is unsustainable and insupportable. As Special Envoy has reminded us again today, urgent progress must be made toward peace if the people of Syria are to have any hope for a better future. Let 2024 be the year in which genuine progress is made. In the meantime, we must all redouble our efforts to keep the people of Syria and their hopes alive. Our ask has been consistent. We need civilians and civilian infrastructure to be protected. We need sustained humanitarian access throughout the country through all modalities. And we need urgent and adequate funding to sustain the life-saving humanitarian response. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mrs. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Geir Peterson, as well as the Director for the Humanitarian Financing and Resource Mobilization Division of UN OCHA, Madam Doughton, for their overview of the political humanitarian situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. The unprecedented toll of casualties of the escalation in the Palestine-Israel conflict zone has provoked additional tensions in the friendly country of Syria. Against the backdrop of Israel's brutal military operation in the Gaza Strip and the ongoing armed raids on the west bank of the Jordan River, we have observed a stark increase in various forces and units' presence in the region. There are increasing flights of the Israeli Air Force targeting Syrian objects, first and foremost the airports in Damascus and Aleppo, which are used as the main gateways for the introduction into Syria of UN humanitarian assistance, as well as the heightened hostilities and an exchange of strikes on the blue line between Lebanon and Israel are fraught with risks of dragging Syria into a full-blown regional confrontation. This needs to be avoided at all costs. At the same time, in the country, the existing difficulties in the country persist and are worsening. The terrorist hotbed in Libya, hostilities between the Kurds and pro-Turkish groups, instability in the south, including the Atanf area zone, which is under the U.S. control. We would note that in the context of the situation in the Gaza Strip, our U.S. colleagues are actively exploiting the premises of self-defense, and countering the threat of terrorism, unjustifiably asserting that this right is something which not only Israel enjoys, Israel occupying power in Palestine, but also Washington and its allies, they assert, enjoy this right. They who have an illegitimately occupied part of Syrian territory, allegedly under the pretext of countering ISIL and Al-Qaeda. At the same time, the U.S. is obstinately denying Damascus both the right to counter Security Council-listed HTS terrorists in Idlib and the right to self-defense from indiscriminate Israeli attacks. Under these circumstances, what is the silence of our Western colleagues is deafening. They cannot fail to understand the risks which directly emanate from such reckless acts. We firmly condemn the ongoing strikes targeting Syria as egregious violations of Syrian sovereignty and the basic provisions of international law, including international humanitarian law. In the context of the advancement of Syrian political settlement through Security Council Resolution 2254, we consistently, unwaveringly support the resumption of the continuous work of the Constitutional Committee with the mediation of the United Nations. Support for this has also been voiced in the final outcome of the sixth session of the Russian-Arab Cooperation Summit at the level of foreign affairs, which completed its work in Marrakesh, Morocco. In it, mention is made of the desire to resume work on the Syrian constitutional track with assistance from the United Nations. In this connection, we trust that you, Mr. Peterson, will provide assistance to the Syrian parties to find new mutually acceptable platforms for the Constitutional Committee without, at the same time, dispersing efforts in other areas which are not supported by the Syrians themselves. Mr. President, we continue to be persuaded of the need to uphold the basic right of the Syrian refugees to return as is stipulated under Security Council Resolution 2254, under the strict condition that these efforts are coordinated with Damascus. In this connection, we wish to note the order of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad dating 16 November on the general amnesty for the citizens of the country. This decision was made by the leadership of the Syrian Arab Republic, and this in addition to the 2022 amnesty, is designed to facilitate the return of Syrian refugees to their homes. Furthermore, the Syrian government has demonstrated a willingness to take concrete measures to facilitate civilian reconciliation, working on the detained and missing persons track, thereby facilitating implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254. In the above-mentioned final declaration of the succession of the Russian-Arab Cooperation Forum at the foreign ministers level, Mention is also made of the importance of surmounting the refugee crisis and its consequences, which the Syrian people themselves are facing, as well as the host countries. Accommodating them. They're also noted as they need to strengthen cooperation between the Syrian government and the states hosting refugees in order to alleviate the process of the voluntary, dignified, and safe return to their homes and an end to their plight in coordination with the relevant United Nations agencies. Distinguished colleagues, in the same document, the importance is noted of the delivery of humanitarian assistance to all Syrian regions without any politicization whatsoever. However, with respect to the humanitarian situation in Syria, the reasons for our alarm are only growing. The situation is viewed similarly by humanitarian personnel working in that country. The dearth of appropriate financing, the political conditions established for donor contributions, the sanctions pressure by Western countries, and on the whole, the exceedingly politicized approach to humanitarian operations in this Arab country has resulted in the fact that the situation on the ground is swiftly deteriorating. We urge the UN country team in Damascus to devise a more effective approach to the delivery of assistance to Syrians in need in all regions of the country without any discrimination whatsoever. Now, the resident coordinator is called upon to demonstrate political will and to submit a report on the negative influence of unilateral sanctions on the situation in that country. To that end, there's a mandate from the Second Committee resolution, which the General Assembly approved the day before yesterday, on 19 December. There are instructions to monitor the negative consequences of sanctions, and these apply to the whole country team, including OCHA. What should long ago have been rescinded, is the Internal Secretariat Manual on the parameters and principles for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Syria, which directly links the conduct of recovery efforts in the country to progress on the political track. This is nothing other than the UN Secretariat directly catering to Western anti-Syrian preferences, which casts a shadow on the impartiality requirement for all UN staff, which is enshrined in the Charter. Mr. President, the Syrian government extended on 10 November the permission for the UN to use the Bab as-Salam and Arai cross-border points for another 3 months. That is until 13 February 2024. On the 13th of January 2024, the temporary permission for the United Nations to use the Bab al-Hawa checkpoint will expire. The fate of this is the sovereign decision of Damascus, a decision taken as part of bilateral dialogue between the Syrian government and the UN. In any event, we believe that the humanitarian potential of the Bab al-Hawa checkpoint should not be used by UN personnel from the office in Gaziantep for spontaneous visits to Idlib which are not agreed upon with Damascus. OCHA should be strictly accountable before the authorities of the Syrian Arab Republic on this question. We are aware that the UN is planning, before the end of the year, to finally send 2 northwestern regions in Syria, the first since the non-extension of Security Council 2672, the first humanitarian convoy through the line of contact. We trust that this operation will be a success, for regardless of what some may attempt to assert, the humanitarian needs in regions not under Damascus's control in this part of the country remain high. On the whole, it behooves us to note that the cross-line convoy mechanisms, which our Western and Secretariat colleagues do not, the need for which our Western and Secretariat colleagues have not disputed, continues not to work. We see no particular zeal in working with those who faint-heartedly are called authorities on the ground in order to address this absolutely unacceptable situation, undermining the premise that assistance to Syrians in Idlib needs to be delivered to using all possible means. This brings us to the clear conclusion that the suffering of the Syrian people, like the suffering of the people in Gaza, is something which our Western colleagues have no concern about whatsoever. All they care about are geopolitical games and support for their clients in the region, regardless of what crimes they may perpetrate. Thank you.
I thank the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Doughton, for your sobering briefings. As 2023 comes to a close, the Syrian political process remains frustratingly blocked, and the Syrian people are suffering greatly. This Council continues to rightly discuss the political and humanitarian files each month, yet we have few results to show for our work. For more than 12 years, the Assad regime has waged a brutal war against the Syrian people. On top of that, Syrians are still reeling from the devastating impacts of February's earthquakes. Yet, rather than engage in a political process, in the last few months, the Assad regime has stepped up its attacks on its own people in the northwest of Syria. We all know the responsibility for this war lies at the feet of the Assad regime. The searing images and accounts of the regime's chemical weapons attacks on opposition-led suburbs of Damascus will never fade from our conscience. Nor will we forget the widespread shelling in Homs, massacres in Aleppo, and the present-day bombardment that is killing civilians in Idlib. Just 2 days ago, the General Assembly voted on a U.S. co-facilitated resolution on the human rights situation in Syria that reminded the world of the abuses the regime wants us to forget: the use of chemical weapons, extrajudicial killings, torture and other ill treatment, unjust detentions, enforced disappearances, and gender-based violence. We join the majority of UN member states in reiterating the call for the Syrian regime to immediately release all those arbitrarily held and to provide information about the tens of thousands who are missing. We are alarmed by the reports that violence has reached its worst level since 2019. The hundreds of civilian deaths caused by the regime and Russian offensive in Idlib are deeply concerning. The destruction they have caused to infrastructure and the threats they pose to humanitarian operations put hundreds of thousands of people at risk during the cold winter months. While we welcome the 3-month extension of the UN's arrangement with the regime for access through Bab al-Salam and al-Rai crossings to access areas in need in northwest Syria, we also underscore that this piecemeal approach does not fully meet the urgent humanitarian need. We continue to underscore the importance of predictable, sustainable access, particularly to improve efficiencies and allow for sufficient staffing and planning. We note that discussions between the UN and the regime regarding renewed cross-border access through the crucial crossing at Bab al-Hawa continue. We support Undersecretary General Griffiths' efforts in this regard and remain hopeful for a positive outcome. As Brazil prepares to conclude its council term, we want to acknowledge the close collaboration of the humanitarian penholders, Brazil and Switzerland, to focus the Council's work on the needs of the Syrian people. And we look forward to continued reporting to the Council and close attention to this file. As we appeal for calm in Syria, we also reiterate our condemnation of attacks by Iranian-aligned militia groups on U.S. personnel and facilities in Iraq and Syria. The United States has responded in self-defense, and we reiterate that these attacks by Iranian-aligned groups must stop. Special Envoy Pedersen, we share your concerns about regional spillover. It is in these moments that we must persevere and remain committed to achieving a Syrian-focused and Syrian-led solution to the conflict in line with Resolution 2254, the only viable roadmap for a lasting solution to the conflict. More than 8 years have passed since this Council unanimously adopted that resolution. It is incumbent on all countries seated at this table to do their part and help implement all aspects of this resolution. The Syrian people have been waiting far too long. We support the Special Envoy's efforts to advance the political process and to reconvene the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible. The United States is closely following the popular protests in Suwaida, just as we did when pro-democracy demonstrations first sprung up in the nearby city of Daraa in 2011. The Syrian people deserve the future for which they have fought so hard, including respect for their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United States for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
I speak on behalf of Switzerland and Brazil, co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and OCHA Director for the Humanitarian Finance and Resource Mobilization Division, Lisa Doughton, for their briefings. We also acknowledge the presence of representatives from Syria, Turkey, and Iran in today's meeting. This is the last joint statement together with Brazil before our very esteemed co-pen holder partner concludes its term on the Council. We would like to thank them for their excellent cooperation throughout. We will miss you and use this opportunity to both look back at this year and towards future developments. As we are all aware, in 2023, the people of Syria have experienced severe hardship. The earthquake, with its epicenter in Turkey, has heavily affected northern Syria. People lost their homes, families and community members in a matter of minutes. At least 6,000 people were killed, with many more injured, and thousands of buildings have been destroyed. This has led to further deteriorations of the already dire humanitarian situation. The number of out-of-school children grew by at least 25%. Inadequate sanitary infrastructures in makeshift camps for internally displaced persons, and the lasting extreme drought and water scarcity facilitated the spread of the cholera outbreak across most of Syria. The large-scale vaccination campaign by the UN has been helpful to transforming cholera cases into milder, more manageable infections. However, it still remains a concern. At the same time, food insecurity keeps rising, and cases of severe malnutrition are increasingly reported, especially with children, and we just heard it. Yet, due to lack of funds, the World Food Programme had to reduce drastically rations since the summer, while in 2024 the number of beneficiaries will be significantly reduced. These reductions risk having consequences on access to other basic services, as people will have to prioritize, and leading to increased negative coping mechanisms such as child labor or early marriage. The worrying increase in violence and attacks in the northeast and northwest of the country since October has caused internal displacement, cost lives, and significantly damaged civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, repeated airstrikes on the two main airports of the country have disrupted UN humanitarian aid flights, hampering severely the transports of humanitarian goods and personnel. We recall that international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties, and the protection of civilians must be ensured at all times. Moreover, the cross-border mechanism of aid delivery went through a major shift this year. Following the devastations of the earthquake, Syria has agreed to open the Bab al-Salam and al-Rey border crossings in order to facilitate the emergency response. The time-bound authorization has been renewed until 13 February. In July, the authorization for the UN to operate the Bab al-Hawa cross-border aid mechanism from Turkey to northwest Syria transitioned from a Security Council mandate to a consent-based arrangement, which is set to expire on 13 January. In the middle of harsh winter conditions, we trust that all of the authorizations will be renewed without conditions and time limit, as the lifeline for millions of people depend on those. Parties must allow and facilitate humanitarian access to all people in need. This is an obligation under international humanitarian law. All access modalities are necessary, including cross-border and cross-line, to support people in need across Syria. We further hope that sufficient funding of the humanitarian response will be ensured so that life-saving assistance as well as early recovery projects can be ensured. In order to prevent that this grim retrospection transforms into an even bleaker outlook for 2024, the international community has a responsibility to act. A political solution in line with Resolution 2254 is urgently needed. In the midst of the turmoil in Gaza, with its regional implications, the Security Council must not forget the plight of the Syrian people. Mr. President, let me conclude with expressing our appreciation to the United Nations, as well as its partner organizations, for their tireless work and efforts in serving the people in need in Syria. Along with cholera vaccination campaigns, delivery of humanitarian items, food rations, water, sanitation, health and protection services, cash and voucher assistance, and so much more, these humanitarian actors help avert the humanitarian crisis to deepen even more and provided much-needed hope to the people. We need to ensure the context for a safe and efficient implementation of their work. Building on our role on the Council with Brazil so far, Switzerland is committed to keep the Council's continued attention on the humanitarian situation in Syria. I thank you. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would now like to make a statement of my national capacity on the political situation in Syria. As 2023 draws to a close, Switzerland can look back on a pivotal year for Syria. The earthquakes of 6 February, which shook a country already devastated by war, revived welcome regional diplomatic efforts under the aegis of the League of Arab States. These diplomatic efforts seem to have stalled, and we can only regret this. The current political status quo, coupled with the renewed intensity of the conflict, is of great concern to us. We are also concerned about the serious risk of a major regional escalation into which Syria could be drawn. We must avoid this situation at all costs. We wish to point out that the solutions to the conflict in Syria are known. They're contained in Resolution 2254, which the Council adopted precisely 8 years ago. At a time of great regional tension, its implementation is particularly urgent. In addition to a national ceasefire, a multifaceted commitment is needed. This includes resuming the work of the Constitutional Committee. In this respect, we regret the lack of significant progress and urge all parties concerned to commit themselves in good faith and to collaborate with the Special Envoy, whom we thank for his efforts to relaunch such a process. Switzerland remains ready to make Geneva available to host the meetings of this committee as well as any other type of talks and initiatives aimed at promoting a lasting peace in Syria. Mr. President, in view of the tragic human toll of the past year, we once again call on all parties to establish a nationwide ceasefire and to ensure the protection of civilians. It is essential that all parties respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law, in particular the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. It is imperative that the civilian population and civilian objects, including infrastructure indispensable to the survival of the population, be protected. This Council must make this its priority. The Syrian population desperately needs this. For its part, Switzerland will spare no effort. Switzerland would like to pay tribute to the remarkable commitment of Syrian civil society. These organizations play a crucial role in easing tensions and bringing about national reconciliation. Like the international, impartial, and independent mechanism, they play an important role in documenting international crimes, which is essential in the fight against impunity. Their work is therefore fundamental to achieving lasting peace. We would like to reaffirm our full support for them and stress the need to provide them with the resources they need to carry out their work. Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement. I now give the floor to Ghana.
Francia, perdón.
France, I'm sorry. France.
Okay. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Geir Peterson as well as Lisa Doughton for their statements. I wish to highlight 2 points. Absent of a political prospect, there can be no lasting and fair peace in Syria, nor can there be stability within the region. 8 years ago, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2254, which called for the establishment of a credible and inclusive political process in Syria. We are far from having achieved sufficient progress due to the intransigence of the regime and its refusal to make the slightest concession. Human rights violations continue to remain rife. Frequently, there is complete impunity for this, and political demands are ongoing. Violations against the Syrian people are ongoing. The bombardment of the regime and supporters in the northwest in Syria are an unfortunate example of this. This is permanent instability, and Captagon trafficking is another manifestation thereof, which represents a threat to the region. The conditions for the voluntary, safe, dignified return for refugees to the country have not been met. Damascus has not made any concrete commitments to that end. We reiterate our support for the countries that host these thousands of Syrians. Under these circumstances, Geyer-Peterson's mediation is critical because much yet needs to be done. And in this regard, I would recall France's support for Mr. Peterson's efforts. There is a vital need to keep our attention and collective efforts focused on a political solution to the crisis in Syria at a time when the war in Gaza shows that a crisis that is considered to be frozen can ultimately erupt if the root causes are not addressed. The humanitarian situation is also worsening. The resumption of hostilities in the northwest and northeast have compounded the tremendous suffering of civilians who have not been spared in any way this year. France is also particularly concerned at food instability as we approach winter. There's a vital need for more donors to be able to mobilize to deliver assistance to Syria. In this particularly grim context, international humanitarian law needs to be upheld by all parties in Syria. There is a particular need to guarantee access for humanitarian assistance in a secure, predictable, and transparent way, and there's a need to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian personnel. As the authorization for the United Nations to use the Bab al-Hawa checkpoint is set to expire on the 13th of January, we urge the Syrian regime to renew this authorization without a time limitation. The use of additional checkpoints and crossing points should also be considered. There's a vital need for the Council to remain seized of the matter for the Secretariat to provide written reports on the humanitarian response in Syria. Thank you.
I thank France and give the floor to Ghana.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this joint statement on behalf of the African members of the Security Council. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Director Lisa Dalton for their briefings and welcome the participation of the representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Turkey in this meeting. The humanitarian crisis in Syria has continued to maintain its downward trajectory, with an overwhelming number of Syrians requiring various forms of assistance. As we heard again today, unfortunately, children and displaced people are bearing the brunt of the country's acute and rising food security crisis. At the same time, necessities such as water and electricity are in short supply, with millions having to live without them. Added to the economic challenges, cuts to humanitarian support due to funding shortfalls, and the wanton destruction of agricultural infrastructure resulting from the prolonged conflict has created a crisis within a crisis. The upsurge in violence in parts of the country has worsened the protection concerns as thousands of civilians remain displaced and are unable to safely and voluntarily return to their homes. Women and girls have been particularly vulnerable under such circumstances as they are exposed to gender-based violence in displacement camps. Consequently, the daily lives of Syrian women and girls are marred by gender-based violence, early and forced marriage, and characterized by limited opportunities and resources. Mr. President, amid this unending crisis, funding shortages persist, with this year's humanitarian response plan recording the lowest contributions of 33% in the past 3 years. The low funding has constrained aid agencies' ability to provide the needed support to vulnerable populations. We reiterate our appeal to the international community to support the humanitarian cause in the country to ease the human suffering in Syria. In view of the dire nature of the humanitarian situation, the A3 pledges its full support for any mode of aid delivery that helps the most vulnerable people. We urge the parties to collaborate closely with the United Nations to create a safe and secure environment for unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid through all modalities. Given the substantial number of beneficiaries of the cross-border aid delivery mechanism, the A3 urges the Syrian national government to renew the authorization for the use of the Bab al-Hawa border crossing before its expiration in January 2024. This is vital to maintain an uninterrupted supply of life-saving assistance in the area. Despite the broader scope of this delivery system, The A3 is of the view that aid distribution across the front lines is equally important and should be expanded to complement the cross-border supplies. Mr. President, it is regrettable that the political situation in Syria continues to deteriorate, notwithstanding international and regional efforts to find a lasting solution to the conflict. The Arab Spring that had renewed hope of a new dawn of democracy in Syria has failed to deliver on the aspirations of the youth. Instead, Syria is still marked by political instability and violence, with devastating consequences for civilian lives and well-being. Rising military hostilities in the country in recent times without regard to safeguarding civilian lives is deepening the crisis. We remind the parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. All parties must exercise maximum restraint and take proactive steps towards de-escalations. The parties involved must remember that no group can win in the midst of such a constant bloodshed. A nationwide ceasefire remains sine qua non for the start of the political process in accordance with Resolution 2254. The most workable solution to the conflict remains a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned inclusive political process undertaken with the support of the international community under the aegis of the United Nations. In this regard, the role of the United Nations Special Envoy Geir Pedersen remains critical if the political process is to crystallize into a tangible outcome that brings respite and restore the hopes of all Syrians. Genuine commitment to the peace process and support of the parties to his efforts, including the step-for-step confidence-building measures, will go a long way to ensure peaceful resolution of the conflict. Reconvening the meeting of the small body of the Constitutional Committee with active participation of all parties will give impetus to the political process. We therefore call for broad consensus behind the proposal of the Special Envoy for prompt resumption of the meetings of the committee without further delay. Mr. President, the A3 welcomes the report of the Secretary General on the implementation of the resolution on the establishment of the independent Institution on Missing Persons in the Syrian Arab Republic. We call for full cooperation of all stakeholders to help address the plight of the detained and missing. The families of the victims deserve to know the fate of their loved ones. In concluding, the A3 reiterates its collective call for a nationwide ceasefire and the immediate resumption of negotiations among the parties towards a political settlement that brings comprehensive and lasting peace and stability to Syria in line with Resolution 2254 of 2015. Even as the term of Ghana and Gabon on the Council ends, we assure the people of Syria of our continuing solidarity with them in their quest for peace and security. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ghana for your statement. I give the floor to China.
Mr. President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Dalton for their briefings. Currently, the neighboring environment of Syria continues to deteriorate, and the spillover risks of the Palestinian-Israeli situation continues to accumulate, which have had some complex impact on the situation in Syria. Recently, multiple occasions in Syria, including the Damascus airport, suffered frequent airstrikes. China is deeply concerned about this. We call upon all relevant parties to stay calm and exercise restraint, refrain from any actions that may escalate tensions, and spare no effort to reduce the risks for regional security. The international community, in particular a major country, should play a constructive role in preventing the spread of the conflict. The urgent priority is to stop all illegal military operations in Syria and end illegal military presence in the country. Political settlement is the fundamental way out for the Syrian issue. China supports the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process and calls upon all Syrian parties to enhance dialogue and work for substantive progress in the work of the Constitutional Committee. We welcome the extensive engagement by Special Envoy Pedersen with all parties on the implementation of Resolution 2254 and expect Arab countries to step up coordination and facilitate the political settlement of the Syrian issue. The counterterrorism situation in Syria remains complex and dire. We support the Syrian government in taking necessary measures to combat terrorism and safeguard the country's security and stability, and in strengthening counterterrorism capacity building. The international community should fight all terrorism in Syria with zero tolerance. Mr. President, China has always supported the UN in maintaining positive interactions with the Syrian government and effectively implementing the new arrangement for cross-border humanitarian assistance on the basis of fully respecting Syria's sovereignty and the ownership of the Syrian government. In recent years, UN humanitarian funding for Syria has continued to decline, over which we have expressed concerns multiple times. The relevant donors should earnestly fulfill their commitments and effectively meet the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people. It needs to be pointed out that unilateral sanctions and resource plundering have long hindered the recovery and development of Syria's economy and society and aggravated the humanitarian challenges facing the country. We urge the relevant parties to immediately and unconditionally end these illegal actions. Thank you, President.
Agradezco al representante de China.
I thank China for your statement. And I'll give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Doughton for their briefings. President, today in our final session of the year on this item, we should reflect on the situation in Syria over the last 12 months. 12 months in which there has been no progress on the political process, no improvement in civil or political rights for Syrians or on arbitrary detentions, no improvement in the conditions to enable the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees. The humanitarian crisis has deepened and the captagon trade has only grown. As we enter the new year, we believe there are 3 areas where the Council can meaningfully focus. First, the threat posed to the region from actors within Syria remains of grave concern. We are particularly concerned by the continuing attacks against the global coalition against Daesh in northeast Syria, the increasing tensions along the Jordanian-Syrian border, and the reported strikes into Israeli territory by Assad regime and Iranian-affiliated forces. Regional escalation serves nobody's interest. Second, UN humanitarian access at Bab al-Hawa remains vital. Over 3/4 of all UN aid transits via this crossing, and it remains a critical lifeline for 4.1 million Syrians. The Syrian regime's current permissions expire on 13th of January. We fully expect them to be renewed. Cross-line operations can complement, but not replace, the essential support which cross-border mechanisms provide. Finally, we need to continue to support the UN Special Envoy in his efforts to convene a meeting of the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible in the new year. Mr. President, 18th of December marked 8 years since this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2254. As we have said many times, implementation of this resolution remains the only way to end this conflict and provide sustainable peace and stability to the Syrian people. Thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for your statement, and I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil aligns itself with the statement made by Switzerland in our capacity as co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. We also thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Director Lisa Doughton for their briefings. I will now speak in my national capacity on the political aspects of the conflict. But first, I would like to express our sincere appreciation for the very constructive partnership we have had with Switzerland in facilitating the Council's discussions on this file during a challenging year for Syria and the region, as for the Council as well. Mr. President, 2023 marks a year of change in the dossier, notably being the first in many years without a resolution on cross-border assistance, despite the intensive negotiating process led by the co-pen holders Brazil, and Switzerland. Currently, 3 crossing points are being used to deliver aid to those in need with the consent of the Syrian government. We welcome this important moment of cooperation between Syria and the humanitarian community, coordinated by OCHA, and hope that it continues to move in the right direction for the benefit of the Syrian people and the future of the country. The UN's role in aid delivery remains vital, especially as a rising number of Syrians depend on humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in recent months, we have witnessed an escalation of violence in Syria and the region. The situation in northern Syria has worsened. In the northwest, there have been reports of airstrikes resulting in civilian casualties and significant damage to civilian infrastructure. These include attacks by the Security Council designated terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There have been disturbing reports of violence in the northeast, including attacks on civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian law must be respected. Civilians and civilian property must be protected during hostilities. Syria has been repeatedly affected by the current escalation of the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Strikes on Aleppo and Damascus airports have disrupted UNRWA's flights on more than one occasion. The risk of regional escalation is real and deeply worrying. In the midst of this growing instability, we urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint. We emphasize the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria in accordance with international law and the resolutions of this Council. Brazil has consistently maintained that there is no military solution to the Syrian conflict. Given the escalating humanitarian crisis and deteriorating security conditions in Syria, an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire is urgently needed. We are grateful to Special Envoy Geir Pedersen for his continuous efforts to re-engage key stakeholders in the search for a solution to the current stalemate in the political process. Being so legitimately proud of its vast community of Syrian descent, Brazil follows closely the situation in the country and fully shares the Secretary General's assessment that, quote, nothing would do more to alleviate the suffering in Syria and stem the tide of humanitarian needs than an inclusive, comprehensive, and sustainable political solution to end the conflict consistent with Security Council Resolution 2254 for 2015, end quote. Diplomacy and genuine political will must be given every opportunity to succeed. Let us not only hope, but also work diligently towards a political outcome for Syria that will ultimately bring the peace, stability, and reconciliation so desired by the Syrian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, President. First, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Director Ms. Doden for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned about the risk that the conflict in Gaza could escalate and expand across the region. The security situation in Syria is already fragile, with sporadic clashes between Israel and Syria in Golan Heights, Israeli airstrikes, including on Syria's international airports, ongoing hostilities in the north, and various military clashes involving ISIL and other Islamic resistance groups. OCHA notes that the humanitarian impact of recent hostilities in the northwest is the highest since 2019. Any misjudgment could lead to a new large-scale military conflict. All parties concerned must exercise maximum restraint to avoid this. Clearly, there is a need to refocus the political process to address the root causes of the Syrian crisis, which have long been ignored. In this vein, we highly appreciate Special Envoy Pedersen's active diplomacy based on a step-by-step approach. but unfortunately, the prospects for reconvening the Constitutional Committee, which remains an important aspect of political process based on Resolution 2254, remain dim. Even as the international community focuses on Gaza conflict, the importance of supporting Syrian-led and Syrian-owned dialogue should not diminish. All parties must overcome their differences as soon as possible, including on the issue of the venue of the committee. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation remains alarming and is worsening. Based on the Syrian government's decision, cross-border aid through 3 border crossings have become a lifeline for more than 4 million people in the northwest. In particular, Bab al-Hal border crossing is vital and must remain open. We also note the 12th round of cross-line assistance is being planned by the end of this year. Yet, OCHA warns that the low level of funding is unprecedented for humanitarian crisis of this scale. With this in mind, Japan has recently decided to provide approximately $32.6 million in additional humanitarian assistance to Syria, which includes the aids for Syrian neighboring countries, and we call on other donors to do the same. Mr. President, regarding the refugees and internally displaced persons in Syria, we are deeply concerned that conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns do not currently exist. Furthermore, it is urgent to address the issue of missing persons. In this regard, we welcome the recent report of the Secretary General on progress towards the full functioning of the independent institution on missing persons authorized by the UN General Assembly in June. Japan will support this institution as it moves to begin substantive work in the near future. As the year end is approaching, we express our sincere gratitude to Brazil for its role as a Syrian humanitarian co-pen holder together with Switzerland. We would like to stress Japan's commitment to continue addressing the Syrian crisis together with the Council, including 5 new members. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Japan for your statement, and I give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I thank Mr. Geir Peterson and Ms. Doughton for their briefings today. As this is our last meeting on the Syrian political and humanitarian file during the UAE term at the Security Council, allow me to share a few of our thoughts on this file. Since 2014, the main focus of this Council has been to meet the needs of the Syrian people by establishing the cross-border mechanism to Syria and renewing it on a regular basis, which has contributed to providing relief aid to millions of Syrians. However, we have noticed during our 2-year term on the Security Council that the political track has not received similar attention by the Council. This is despite the fact that reaching a peaceful solution is necessary to address the humanitarian crisis in a suitable manner. While aid continues to flow through the 3 crossings, Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam, and Al-Rai, with the approval of the Syrian government and the efforts of the UN and humanitarian workers on the ground, the Security Council should simultaneously intensify its work on the political track and support the efforts of the Special Envoy for Syria to reach a peaceful solution as the only means to end the suffering of the Syrian people and to restore security and stability in Syria and the broader region. Over the past several years, the political track has not seen any concrete progress towards ending the Syrian crisis. Meanwhile, the humanitarian and economic conditions have continued to deteriorate to unprecedented levels. Today, there are more than 15 million Syrians in need of humanitarian aid. The current situation requires the Security Council to allocate the same level of attention to the Syrian crisis as it does to other crises on its agenda. There is no doubt that ending the Syrian crisis will contribute to resolving one of its most serious consequences, the displacement crisis. Today, there are about 7 million displaced Syrians. This requires providing appropriate living conditions for the voluntary, dignified, and safe return of refugees and displaced persons, including through the implementation of early recovery projects. While we stress the important work of the Constitutional Committee enhancing dialogue between the Syrian parties to end the crisis through a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process without any foreign interference, we believe that merely holding meetings is not sufficient. The political path extends beyond that, and it requires all diplomatic efforts to be focused on resolving the Syrian crisis rather than only managing it. Also, these efforts are necessary to address security conditions in Syria, which will worsen if there's no political solution on the horizon. We have closely monitored with concern the violent escalation in the northwest of Syria, along the Syrian borders, and across many other regions in Syria. This reaffirms the need to continue working towards de-escalation and a ceasefire throughout all Syrian regions. This issue has become particularly urgent in light of the escalating tensions in our region. The conditions in Syria cannot afford any more escalation. In closing, Mr. President, we look forward to the day when Syria turns the page on conflict and regains its security and stability. The Syrian people have an ancient civilization. They deserve to lead better lives and a future with dignity on their homeland as we have always known them, or as has long been the case. The UAE will continue to support regional and international efforts aimed at realizing these objectives. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Arab Emirates, and I give the floor to Malta.
President, let me begin by thanking Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Doughton for their briefings today. In 2023, Syrians faced the greatest level of humanitarian need since the beginning of this 13-year-old conflict. As we come to the end of the year, your somber reflections remind us that next year must be better. President, over the past 12 months, Syrians have had to contend with the impact of multiple devastating earthquakes and aftershocks, a humanitarian crisis, climate shocks, and now major conflict on their border, which threatens to bring even greater violence and turmoil to the region. Despite these compounding political and humanitarian crises, Syrians remain dignified and resilient, losing neither hope nor their voice in demanding a just end to this brutal conflict. We commend the United Nations, especially OCHA, for their diligent work throughout this year. We thank them for their efforts in engaging with the parties to ensure the free flow and facilitation of humanitarian assistance, both within Syria but also across borders at a time when it was needed most. The continued functioning of the crossings at Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai has greatly supported the aid delivery mechanism at Bab al-Hawa, a crossing which remains a lifeline to millions in the northwest today. We expect that, once again, the agreement for the use of Bab al-Hawa by the UN and its humanitarian partners will be extended before its expiration in mid-January, and that all aid delivery modalities will remain in place as long as they are needed. President, violence has continued unabated in the north of the country. Protests have erupted in the south, and Syrian airports remain subject to routine airstrikes. Grave violations of children's rights remain a major concern to Malta, especially with a record number of children internally displaced. As we have heard throughout this year, the roots of these humanitarian needs in Syria are political. Without adequate, even modest progress on the political front, we will be unable to progress towards a just, lasting, and deserved peace. The stalling of the precious political momentum seen in the weeks directly after the earthquakes is deeply regrettable. In such a context of deadly fragility, the burden of political inaction is borne by the people of Syria, those who continue to suffer and face daily indignities. The burden is ever increasing, with the cost of basic commodities at an all-time high, and the humanitarian assistance at an all-time low. As we have heard on many occasions here in this chamber, shortages of these essentials make women and girls more vulnerable in poverty, violence, and exploitation. President, we regret that despite extensive efforts by the Special Envoy, we have been unable to see the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee, and Steps for Steps has yet to deliver the much-needed confidence required to tackle the many pressing issues facing Syria. We once again call for a nationwide ceasefire to help create the conditions for progress in line with Resolution 2254. 13 years of fighting should indicate that there is no military solution to this conflict. An inclusive political process is the only way forward. President, as we enter 2024, we must neither become complacent nor numb to the challenges and suffering of those in Syria. We must again redouble our political and humanitarian efforts to make sure Syria's future does not mirror its present. I thank you.
I thank Malta for your statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, President. At the outset, allow me to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Representative Director Doughton for their insights. Also, I would like to extend Albania's full support for your good offices, Special Envoy Pedersen. The magnitude of destruction, as described once more today by many, has turned Syria into wreckage. The rate of violence in the northwest due to the governmental attacks and airstrikes in Idlib is the highest in 3 years, and the humanitarian needs are larger than ever. Considering the situation in the region, we echo the call of the Special Envoy for maximum restraint, the escalation in respect of the nationwide ceasefire, and in full compliance with international humanitarian law, as well as step-for-step measures to revitalize the political process based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Without breaking this political impasse imposed by the Syrian regime, the envision of a brighter future for Syrian people becomes more difficult. We urge the regime to use the momentum and not to delay the convening of the Constitutional Committee as a practical necessary step to put back in track the Syrian-led, UN-facilitated political process. And we support the efforts of the Special Envoy Pedersen in this regard. President, the humanitarian situation is an extension of the political stalemate. The economic devastation, including inflation, unemployment, and the collapse of the essential services, has compounded the already dire humanitarian situation, putting communities into further desperation. The international community should stand in solidarity with Syrian people and deepen its support for the humanitarian response plan. The aid delivery should remain predictable, sustainable, and transparent. In this vein, we urge for the extension of the authorization of the Bab al-Wawa cross-border beyond the January deadline. President, silence is no longer an option. This Council should be united in supporting the people in Syria. We owe it to the millions of refugees who cannot return safely to their homes. We owe it to the children stripped of their childhoods and victims of sexual and gender-based violence. We believe that pursuit of justice is fundamental to provide some relief for the victims of torture and gross human rights violations, to restore human dignity and provide closure to families of missing people or detainees. The decision of last month of ICJ for Syria to take all measures to prevent acts of torture and other cruel treatment is a landmark for accountability. Another potentially positive note, an upcoming launch of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria, a mechanism supported by Albania when voted in the GA in June, would provide an answer for the hundreds of thousands lives interrupted, for all those whose fate remains unknown and voice silent. Above all, it would bring an end to the suffering of the families who saw their loved ones forcibly separated in the shadows of the conflict. And it is important, this process, to be transparent and coordinated with UN. In concluding, I want to reiterate that Albania will remain a strong advocate of the Syrian people in their pursuit for justice and for a better future in dignity. I thank you.
Agradezco la
I thank the representative of Albania for her statement. I will not make a statement in my national capacity as representative of Ecuador. We take note and thank Gary Pedersen and Madam Lisa Doughton of OCHA for their briefings, and I welcome the representatives of Syria, Turkey, and Iran to the meeting. For Ecuador, it is essential to step up diplomatic efforts that make it possible to re-engage dialogue and move towards a political solution to the situation in Syria in conformity with the provisions of Resolution 2254. We would encourage the Special Envoy to continue conversations with the members of the Astana Group, neighboring countries, regional partners, and other actors inside and outside of Syria, with the goal of bringing about the meetings of the Constitutional Committee and to discuss substantive issues on it regarding its operations. We agree with the Special Envoy Pedersen when he states that there is a direct relationship between the lack of progress in the political sphere and the risk of an escalation of violence. This impact will further complicate the security and humanitarian situation in Syria and the region. We regret that the current outbreak of conflict in the region has led to an escalation of violence in Syria and has increased threats to the civilian population. The escalation of hostilities in Damascus, Idlib, and western Aleppo speak to the fact that Syria is experiencing the most violent period since 2019 right now. It's unacceptable that 45,000 people in the city of Ebreha remain without access to sources of drinking water due to the military use of the water station, which increases the risk of the spread of diseases such as cholera. We would like to make an appeal to abide by international humanitarian law and in this context to protect the civilian population infrastructure critical for their survival as well as humanitarian assistance actors. The sheer number of people that require humanitarian assistance to survive in a situation of poverty, malnutrition, and displacement should serve as a reminder to that the Council must continue to examine the situation in Syria. Furthermore, we urge the government of Syria to offer responses on the condition and whereabouts of disappeared persons and those arbitrarily detained, as well as to establish a transparent system of accountability. We'd like to express the hope that all political and social sectors of society, especially women, take a meaningful part in the processes aimed at building a peaceful and prosperous future in Syria with the goal of restoring a civic space and the rule of law. In conclusion, I'd like to express gratitude to Brazil and Switzerland for their commitment and work as co-penholders. Ecuador will continue to support efforts to facilitate the work of the UN team on the ground and provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Syria. Thank you very much. I go back to my role as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I congratulate you on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also thank your predecessor, the permanent representative of the People's Republic of China, for successfully conducting the work of the Council last month. Mr. President, today's briefing on the political and humanitarian questions in my country, Syria, is the last for this year. It is held Amidst ongoing threats and challenges my country has been facing for years due to terrorism, the illegal military presence of the US and Turkish forces in parts of Syria, the escalation of repeated Israeli attacks on Syria's vital facilities, and the exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis due to the failure of donors to fund the humanitarian response plan, in addition to the disastrous repercussions of the illegal unilateral coercive measures imposed by Western countries on my country. Therefore, the condemnation of this Council of all these violations of Syrian sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, international law, and the Charter of the UN is a legal responsibility and a humanitarian necessity. Mr. President, we have listened to the briefing by Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy for Syria, and we continue to engage in dialogue and coordinate with him on his work. The Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates have met Mr. Pedersen last week in Geneva and stressed Syria's commitment to a Syrian-led, Syrian-old political process without any external interference on the basis of the respect for Syria's independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, it is regrettable that 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we witness some Western countries continuing to act in contempt of the declaration through their complicity and taking part in brutal crimes and genocide committed by Israel in the Gaza Strip, and through their continued aggression against Syrian infrastructure and Lebanese infrastructure, the latest of which was the rocket attack that targeted Reef Dimashq on the 17th of this month. Syria warns Israel against the consequences of continuing to persist in these attacks, which could push the region towards a comprehensive escalation that cannot be contained, and the consequences for the region and the world would be unsustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, the US and the EU continue to impose unilateral, inhumane sanctions that have significant impact on the enjoyment of the most basic human rights by Syrians, including children, women, and the elderly, as they are denied food, medical care, electricity, housing, and essential services. The report of Ms. Elena Johan, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, is proof of this, and I quote, "The comprehensiveness of existing unilateral sanctions against the Syrian Arab Republic and the growing over-compliance, in particular following the imposition in 2019 of the Syrian Civilian Protection Act by the US of America, have placed the country in a straitjacket with serious adverse effects on the broad spectrum of human rights." Here, we would like to commend the adoption by the GA of the resolution unilateral economic measures as a means of political and economic coercion against developing countries, which requests the Secretary General to monitor and study the impact on the affected states. My delegation looks forward to the UN and ESCWA conducting the study on the impact of these UCMs on UN activities and the humanitarian situation in Syria. Mr. President, the United States of America has not only directly engaged in the aggression against the Gaza Strip, shoulder by shoulder with the Israeli war criminals, and turning a blind eye to the repeated Israeli attacks on civilian infrastructure in Syria. It continues its destructive policies by insisting on its illegal military presence on Syrian territory, and its support for separatist militia, its looting of Syrian resources, oil, wheat, and gas, in addition to supporting and training the terrorist groups in Al-Hol and Rukban camps. And in the same context, the Turkish forces continue their illegal presence on our territory, and they provide logistical, military, and financial support to terrorist organizations in the northwest of Syria, which are listed as terrorist groups by the Security Council. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic affirms that the return of Syrian refugees to their homeland is a fundamental objective. Syrian refugees returning to their country enjoy, like other Syrian citizens, all the rights and duties guaranteed by the Constitution and the laws. In this context, measures and steps have been taken to provide for the dignified return of the refugees. We continue to take a positive approach to overcome the repercussions of the terrorist war against Syria. Following the amnesty decree issued by the President of the Republic last month, the Syrian government opened the door for regularizing the security situation of all those who entered or left Syria illegally. Also, we announced further measures related to the recruitment and the laws on military service. The government of Syria continues to coordinate and cooperate with OCHA towards improving the humanitarian situation in Syria. My country has recently renewed for an additional 3 months the authorization granted to the UN to use Bab al-Salama and al-Rai crossings out of our concern for humanitarian assistance to reach beneficiaries throughout the Syrian Arab Republic, including in the northwest. However, these joint efforts face the real problem of the low funding rate of the humanitarian response plan, which did not exceed 33%, and we are just days away from the end of the year. The World Food Programme, due to the lack of funding, has announced the end of its food assistance program starting next month throughout Syria. My delegation is surprised that some UN teams are reaching out to terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council, and we stress the need for them to stop this immediately. We also stress that the continued presence of OCHA's office in Gaziantep is a waste of resources at the expense of those who really need the assistance and deserve it. Ladies and gentlemen, we demand the halt of politicizing humanitarian work and putting political conditions on early recovery projects and providing sustainable solution and an immediate end, an unconditional end to UCMs. We also stress the need for the repeated Israeli aggressions on our civilian airports to stop. This has led to cancellation of a total of 27 UN humanitarian flights between the 12th of October and the 1st of December. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante la
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. President, we thank Mr. Peterson, the Special Envoy, and Ms. Dalton from OCHA for their briefing. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains extremely challenging. People are grappling with economic hardship worsened by the U.S. imposition of unlawful sanctions. Adding to this challenge in the difficult underfunding the humanitarian response plan with only 32% of the needed funds secured. This significant shortfall is seriously hindering the capacity of the UN. A commitment to impartial assistance is crucial to ensuring that the humanitarian affairs serve the needs of the affected people without being influenced by political considerations. Donors must refrain from using aid to exert political pressure on Syrian government. Mr. President, on the political track, we support the resuming of meeting of the Constitutional Committee as an effective mechanism for advancing the political process. We support the Special Envoy's effort and his diplomatic engagement with the parties to facilitate the resumption of committee meeting and to advance the political process. The United Nations' role should remain supportive, ensuring that the entire process is guided by Syrian leadership and ownership. Iran stands in favor of return of Syrian refugees to their homeland. The United Nations, especially the High Commissioner for Refugees, plays a central role in this undertaking. We appreciate the support the engagement and constructive dialogue between the Syrian officials and the UN in addressing this pressing issue. Mr. President, the security situation in areas controlled by illegal foreign forces and under occupation is a matter of serious concern. The primary source of insecurity is unlawful presence and continued occupation of U.S. military forces, creating an environment conducive to the growth of the terrorist activities within Syria and the broader region. At the same time, the Israeli regime persists in its act of aggression against Syrian territory. In parallel with the atrocities in the Gaza Strip, this regime engaged in terrorism and aggression within Syrian borders, intentionally targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. We strongly condemn the terrorist attack on its military advisors in Syria on 2nd December, where 2 Iranian advisors were murdered during their mission to support the Syrian army against terrorism. We reaffirm inherent right of the Syrian Arab Republic under international law to take all necessary measures in response to terrorist attacks and acts of aggression by the Israeli regime. We warn against any proactive actions by the Israeli regime that could seriously impact peace and security in the region. Iran called on the Security Council to condemn destabilizing activities of the Israeli regime and its severe violation of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, which pose a threat to peace and stability in the region. In conclusion, Mr. President, the groundless allegation made against my country by the representative of the United States in this chamber that was repeated by the UK is categorically rejected. Contrary to this unfounded claim, Iran has consistently demonstrated its commitment to promoting peace and security in the region. The United States is fully responsible for its decade-long aggressions along with other crimes and unlawful measures in our region. Obstructing the Security Council from fulfilling its charter-based duties to establish a ceasefire and to stop the Israeli war machine against the people of Gaza for more than 2 months has called in doubt the U.S. real concerns about the spillover of the tension and peace and security in the region. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. This week marks the 8th anniversary of the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2254. The resolution reflects the contours of a consensual roadmap for the achievement of a lasting solution to the Syrian conflict. It remains most reliable framework for a sustainable way out of the Syrian crisis, which is through an inclusive, Syrian-owned, Syrian-led political process that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. It mandates the UN to convene representatives of the Syrian regime and the opposition to engage in formal negotiations on a political transition process. And most importantly, it stresses the undeniable fact that it is the Syrian people who will decide the future of their country. All Syrians, including the opposition, diaspora, and refugees. 8 years after its adoption in this chamber, the vision, goals, and roadmap set forth in Resolution 2254 continue to constitute the international consensus for the resolution of the Syrian conflict. That being said, Syria has fallen off many radars recently. Currently, fluidity of the situation in the country and the wider region should not hold us back from addressing the root causes of the problem. Syria is not a post-conflict country. It cannot be without guaranteeing its territorial integrity and political unity, nor can it be without a reinvigorated political process in line with Resolution 2254, or without putting an end to the separatist agenda of terrorist organizations and creating conditions for voluntary, safe, and dignified return of Syrian refugees. Our overall efforts toward the settlement of the conflict must be aimed at a genuine national reconciliation. However, this is not possible by playing against time and with half-hearted efforts that do not contribute to these objectives. It is imperative to overcome the current inertia in the political track and to convene the 9th round of the Constitutional Committee without further delay. The status quo in Syria has become unsustainable, not only politically, but also in terms of its humanitarian and security dimensions. In the 13th year of the conflict, living conditions of the Syrian people are getting harder every day. It is becoming more difficult to access basic needs. Economic crisis is worsening. Deprivation is an everyday reality for millions. In the face of exacerbating domestic problems, as well as risks of regional conflagration of the conflict in Gaza, the preservation of calm in Syria is of critical importance. That is why we call on all relevant parties, both in the region and beyond, to de-escalate tensions. Mr. President, regrettably today, we heard once again a reference by UN Special Envoy to SDF, an offshoot of PKK-YPG terrorist organization, as if it were a legitimate actor. Turkey's counterterrorism operations in the country are an exercise of its inherent right of self-defense in response to acts of terrorism of this organization. PKK-YPG terror organization continues its attempts to advance its separatist agenda in Syria. These attempts include oppressing local populations, forcibly recruiting children, military use, and exploitation of civilian infrastructure. I would like to underline once again that empowering this terrorist organization serves no other purpose than sowing seeds of further instability in Syria and beyond. We will certainly do not allow this criminal entity to realize its insidious designs. Mr. President, as regards the humanitarian situation, we observe that serious shortcomings have emerged in the last months. We would like to emphasize the importance of uninterrupted delivery of cross-border humanitarian assistance, which helps 4.1 million people to hold on to life in northwest Syria. In this connection, we once again underline significance of the UN monitoring mechanism, which guarantees the transparency of the aid deliveries. Planned budget cuts on humanitarian assistance towards Syria are also a serious source of concern. Under these circumstances, all stakeholders and donors have important responsibilities to help eliminate risks facing UN humanitarian response in Syria. We expect the continued use of Bab el-Hawa, Bab el-Salam, and Al Rai border crossings for UN aid deliveries. The continued engagement of the UN Security Council is essential in this regard. Turkey will continue to support the people of Syria and all initiatives towards a sustainable solution to the Syrian conflict. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Turkey for statement. There are no further speakers on the list. I now invite members of the council to informal consultations to continue discussing this item. Thank you. The meeting's adjourned.
SRG SSR.
Ivan Müller, ein estnischer Komponist der Frühromantik, war ein Klarinettenvirtuose. Hören Sie nun sein Konzertstück über das Lied Adelaide von Ludwig van Beethoven, eine Komposition für Klarinette und Orchester. Der Solist ist Dieter Klöcker, er wird begleitet vom Prager Kammerorchester unter der Leitung von Milan Lajcik.